Welcome the explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking a seriously debated thesis from the infographic show. Did systemic economic changes over the last 50 years funnel a staggering amount of wealth directly into the pockets of the baby boomers, leaving younger Americans footing an unprecedented bill? Let's jump right into the data. Here is our docket of evidence for today. First, the generational wealth gap. Second, locking up housing. Third, the exploding college tax. Then, tax cuts and deficits. Fifth, the retirement bait and switch. And finally, the demographic time bomb.
Section 1. The generational wealth gap, establishing the economic baseline.
Now, to really get this, the source takes us back to the 1970s. Think of it as our baseline before any major systemic shifts happened. They used this super interesting example of a summer job to prove a point. Back in 1976, you could work 480 hours at minimum wage as a groundskeeper at UC Berkeley. And guess what? That covered 150% of your annual tuition. You literally paid for school and had cash left over for rent. But fast forward to the projection for 2026, those exact same 480 hours cover only 57% of tuition. It's like the fundamental math for the American dream just broke. So what does this broken math actually look like? Well, the source argues it created extreme wealth concentration. Look at this. Baby boomers and millennials represent pretty much the exact same slice of the US population, right around 20 to 21% each. But boomers currently control over half the nation's wealth. We're talking 51.4%, which is roughly $85 trillion. Meanwhile, millennials sitting at just 10.3%. The explainer makes a very fair point that sure, older generations naturally hold more wealth, but the sheer steepness of this curve, it's absolutely unprecedented.
All right, moving on to Section 2, locking up housing, the ladder pulled up.
We really need to look at where all this wealth is parked. The explainer highlights a massive shift in real estate, from just basic shelter to a locked-down investment vehicle. They share this wild anecdote about a baby boomer father who was lecturing his son about living way beyond his means. The son challenged his dad to go find a house at a price he thought was fair today. After hours of looking, the dad came back totally pale and literally said, "This isn't just expensive, it's impossible. You're playing a rigged game." I mean, get this. That dad paid $25,000 for his first home in 1980. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $93,000 today. But today's median home, it costs over $400,000. It's not just regular inflation either. The cost of a house relative to what people actually earn has absolutely exploded. In 1970, a median home cost roughly 2.4 times the median income. By 2025, that ratio more than doubled to 5.6. And if you're in a job-dense city, oh boy. San Jose is over 10 times the median income, and Los Angeles is at 12.5. Because of this, the age of a typical first-time buyer has been pushed from 29 back in 1980 all the way up to 40 today. The source argues this wasn't an accident. It was cemented by policy. Back in the 70s, suburbs pushed these exclusionary zoning laws, restricting huge chunks of land, like 75%, strictly to single-family homes. This artificially choked the housing supply. Toss in the fact that 43% of boomers today say they're never going to sell their current homes, and, well, you end up with a market where younger people are basically locked out of building equity. Which brings us to Section 3, the exploding college tax, paying for the privilege. Let's see how education just piles onto this housing argument. We're looking at a similar explosion in costs, but this time dumped right onto students. The explainer brings up a crucial point about government subsidies. In 1970, 250 hours of minimum wage work paid for a whole year of public college. By 2020, you'd have to work over 1,000 hours. The core argument here is that boomers benefited from massive public subsidies for their education, but those subsidies were later slashed, meaning today's students have to work 4 times as many hours just to cover tuition. And the result of slashing those subsidies? A massive, massive debt burden. Federal student loan debt has literally doubled since 2007. Gen X is sitting on an average of over $44,000 in debt, and millennials are right behind them with over $40,000. But boomers? Only 6.6% of them carry any student debt at all. The source points out the irony here. The generation that got heavily subsidized schooling effectively made these expensive degrees mandatory for the modern workforce while totally dodging the debt crisis themselves. Okay, moving on. Section 4, tax cuts and deficits, funding the deficit on a credit card. So if taxpayers used to subsidize all that education and infrastructure, where did the money go? The explainer points a finger squarely at federal tax policy, mapping out decades of top-tier tax cuts. In 1981, the Reagan administration slashed the top tax rate from 70% down to 28%, and the national debt tripled. In 2001, the Bush tax cuts cost an estimated $1.7 trillion over 10 years. And in 2017, the Trump administration permanently dropped the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. The argument here is that these policies basically financed government spending by putting it on a giant credit card, borrowing heavily against future generations. And the consequence of that credit card mentality? The source drops this absolutely staggering number: $881 billion. In 2024, the United States is spending $881 billion just to pay the interest on the national debt. Just the interest. To put that into perspective, that is more money than the entire U.S. defense budget. Crazy, right? Let's look at Section 5, the retirement bait and switch, transferring the risk. As if the national debt wasn't enough, the source argues the entire concept of retirement was quietly re-engineered. Let's step through how these mechanics shifted. Step 1. Older generations largely had defined benefit pensions. You did your job, and your company guaranteed your income for life. They took on all the market risk. But then came Step 2. That system was dismantled and replaced by the 401k. Suddenly, you and I have to manage our own funding and absorb all the market losses. Which brings us to a really concerning Step 3. Today, 24% of Gen X has actually had to borrow from their retirement accounts just to survive rising costs. The explainer uses this to show how financial risk was basically transferred directly onto the shoulders of younger workers. Finally, we reach Section 6, the demographic time bomb. The bill that never stops. The source ties all these threads together to spotlight one ultimate looming crisis: an underfunded healthcare system. Think about this stat for a second. 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 and age into Medicare every single day. The explainer warns that massive entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare were built for a completely different demographic reality. They assumed people would be in retirement for maybe 10 to 15 years. They were absolutely not financially modeled for the 20 to 30-year lifespans we're seeing with today's massive aging population. And since healthcare has ballooned to swallow up 18% of the entire U.S. GDP, the cost burden is catastrophic. Since 1999, health insurance premiums have spiked by 342%. Meanwhile, wages, they've only managed a 119% increase. So younger workers are paying way more out of pocket for coverage that's arguably worse. And hey, if you're sitting around hoping for some great wealth transfer to save the day, the source points out that the sheer cost of end-of-life care is actively wiping out middle-class inheritances before they can ever be passed down. To wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves a tough question. Based on all this data, if the previous generation is holding on to 51% of the wealth, but also significantly underfunded the system through massive tax cuts and restrictive housing policies, who is ultimately going to pay the bill for a $38 trillion national debt and soon-to-be bankrupt entitlement programs? Based on this docket of evidence, what happens to the economy when this demographic time bomb finally goes off? It's literally a multi-trillion-dollar question. Thank you guys so much for exploring the data with us today, and keep questioning.